Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What are the communities of the future? What will they look like? What are we doing to prepare for them? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of PBS or community access television station, or perhaps a university that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you're interested in our shows and you would like to share them, we would invite you to go to the website and download any of the programs. They are provided free of charge at no cost as a public service. Today we're taking a look at the communities of the future and what can we expect as we move well into the 21st century. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Rick Smyre. Rick Smyre is an internationally recognized futurist specializing in an area called community transformation. Mr. Smyre has 4 degrees and is president of the Center for Communities of the Future. In 2016, he co-authored a groundbreaking book titled Preparing for a World That Doesn't Exist Yet, framing a second enlightenment to create communities of the future. Rick Smyre literally wrote the book on the topic. Rick, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be here, and have to give credit to my co-author, Neil Richardson, as well, as far as the book's concerned.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
credit where credit is due.
We enjoyed writing it. And,
well, good. We're going to find out.
Hopefully it's something that's worth reading, right?
Well, very good. Well, no, it is. It's a very interesting book, and it's, as I mentioned in the opening, preparing for a world that doesn't exist yet. And the yet part really gets your attention because we see what we have today and what's out there. But let's talk about this. Why did you decide to write this book? Why did you and Neil decide to write it?
Well, Bill, there were 2 reasons. One of the reasons was that the publisher of Changemaker Books, which is based in London and DC, heard about our work from one of the other fellows that's a colleague of ours who lives in Spain. He's a Scot that lives in Spain. And he just happened to mention that how we've been all connected, and so Tim Ward got in touch with me, and he said, I'd like to know what you're doing, and I sent him material, and then he said, would you be willing to write a book? The other reason that it was of interest to me and to Neil is that we've been active over the years in a number of different ways in local communities and the state level, and in some ways nationally. And we at least believe, just our opinion, no truth left in my body at my age, let me tell you, but we believe that so many of the ideas that we're trying to make efficient in this day and time, whether it be for economic development or governance or from the standpoint of education, learning, that they are tailored and developed. They were tailored and developed in an age gone by, and they're no longer appropriate for the future, in our opinion, so many of them.
Now, we're talking about the communities of the future. All of us live in communities. We live in really geopolitical environments, boundaries, if you will. We live in a city, we live in a county or whatever. But when you talk about communities, you're talking about a broader concept. Is that correct? What do you mean by communities?
Well, you'll get used to hearing me, and I'll only say it twice. But one of the phrases we use, Bill, is and both. In other words, it's not just one way of looking at things. Obviously, you have physical communities that are going to be shifting and changing. But in turn, when we talk about communities of the future for our work, it's a network of people in 47 states and 12 other countries that over the years have just self-organized and connected with each other and have been concerned and interested, and so therefore collaborating together on new ideas that we think are important for the future in these various areas that we think communities have to deal with. So it can be a community of practice, it can be a network of people that are collaborating together, it has multiple definitions in terms of what a community means.
Now, you also mentioned in your book that this was part of the Second Enlightenment. The First Enlightenment, I think, was about 1740 through about 1790, something like that. What was the First Enlightenment, in just a couple of words? What was the thrust of that?
Well, that's close enough. Some people say 1725, 1825.
Oh, wherever.
You know, but it so happens that you picked out where the core of the First Enlightenment. And that mainly, it happened in Europe, a number of countries, but the country that I've been so interested in over the years is Scotland. So many of the Scottish ideas, Adam Smith as an economist,
Right.
Patrick Geddes as an individual who was very much involved with the first biological working with nature, David Hume, who was one of the political theorists in the early stage. So there were the First Enlightenment emerged from the Reformation that came out of Geneva, or actually you go back to 1518, and you find that one of the key theorists brought forth these ideas in 1518, and then Geneva became the central part for the Protestant Reformation. And you had John Knox, John Wesley, Zwingli, another one of the thinkers that was the basis for the evolution of the Methodist Church. And so that when John Knox went to Scotland, then over the years, he brought forth an idea that says if you're going to connect with God, because previously priests had to intercede for any individual to connect with God. But when the Reformation came about, then it opened up individuals to be able to, in fact, connect directly through prayer with God. And so therefore, what Knox did was recognize that the ability to read the Bible would lead to the ability for other opportunities for individuals. And so over 50 to 75 years, there came then slowly but surely then a base of citizens who would meet in their homes, read the Bible, and talk about the fact of what the ideas in the Bible and how it applied to their day-to-day lives. And out of that came a new type of economy in Glasgow, and so there was this connection between the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And the First Enlightenment led to the concepts of democracy, of individual worth, of the concept of having an identity for oneself, and that's why the First Enlightenment is so important.
Which was very important. Now, why is this the Second Enlightenment? What are some of the characteristics of this Second Enlightenment?
Well, we gave the term the Second Enlightenment with the idea, with the theory behind this is that we believe, we being those of us collaborating together in this country and other countries, that we happen to be in a transformation, a transition period of history, and that there are a set of ideas that are going to be important for the future that are just now being birthed over the last 30 years or so. And as an example of that, we're moving from the industrial age, which emerged from the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And the industrial age was based on hierarchies, standard answers, and predictability. And we've all, those of us our age, were trained in that kind of thinking. But what's emerging now is basically a different type of economy and society because of the impact of technology. And so you've got such real-time interaction between people, ideas, and processes that the ability to be able to understand how to build networks and webs, understand you have multiple choices, that's why I said and both, and the whole idea of being comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty, because change is just so rapid now. And it's not just change in a traditional sense of reforming change, it's where we're really challenging the underlying assumptions of so much that is a part of the Industrial Revolution, and that's what we call then the Second Enlightenment.
And you're absolutely right. The changes are mind-numbing.
Yes, they are.
They're just dazzling at times. They come so very quickly, and they are so profound. So it's something that we have to deal with it, and we have to confront this very quickly. Now, you have this concept of comprehensive community transformation. What basically does that entail?
Well, let me define it first,
Okay,
and
please.
then I'll connect it to your question. We believe comprehensive community transformation is when you rethink every aspect of the society and economy. That the whole concept of economic development, of governance, of education, leadership, that there will still be the traditional approaches, but more and more you will see evolving the norm of a whole different approach to the concept of how to develop an economy appropriate that can adapt quickly to this kind of change that you said, and it is a massive change. Or how do you create learning experiences for people? So many of the kids, and I'm an ex-school board chairman of 35,000 kids 30 years ago, and I've changed my opinion just almost totally. That so many of the young people that have the technology and are able to get on the internet and talk to anybody in the world, and they sit in classrooms and are still taught the same way we were taught. Well, I think that's getting ready to go by the boards, and so there's a whole different approach, and the ability to be able then to have every aspect of our society and community and economy really challenge the underlying assumption and watch what emerges. It'll be appropriate to an age of fast-paced change that's interconnected, interdependent, and increasingly complex, as we're seeing day in, day out.
And of course, we're seeing that right now with long-distance learning. We see
Absolutely.
with digital connectedness, things like that. That's very commonplace and is really in the vocabulary of younger people in particular. Maybe not me as much, but in younger people. Well, you had in your book two interesting terms. One was traditional leader, and the other master capacity builder. What are the characteristics of a traditional leader versus? Yes, compare them.
Traditional leader we'll define as what I call project leaders that are trained in thinking about the future in a very specific way. Strategic planning. All of us of our age have been trained in strategic planning. Well, that assumes that you can, in effect, predict the outcome and that you can control the processes from where you are to where you want to go. And when I was over in Edinburgh about 1999, I'll never forget, I was sitting there just like we're sitting and talking with two different colleagues, new colleagues. One of them was the head of British Petroleum, a heck of a fine guy named Harry McMillan. And Harry said that he had been down in London 3 weeks before to work on, with the board of British Petroleum, the whole concept of thinking about the future and how they were going to prepare for the future. And they had decided that they weren't going to strategically plan anymore. And that in turn they had a new logo. You've since seen the logo, obviously, over the last 20 years. But I did a double take. And Bill, I did a double take because my background was in strategic planning, and I happen to know that British Petroleum, Shell, Aramco, and Gulf were the oil companies that conceived the whole idea of strategic planning in the 40s and 50s. And so if it had been me or most Americans that I asked him a question, and I would have answered with a specific statement because I would want to answer his question. But he wanted to develop in me the ability, the capacity to think differently. So he said, Rick, what are the two assumptions of strategic planning? And I just gave them to you. One is you can predict the outcome. The other one's you control the process. And he said, we're getting ready to go in Nigeria. We're getting ready to go into China with 4D seismic drilling, which is the part of the drilling now that we see in fracking that's across the world. And he said, we don't have a clue as to whether this is going to work or not. So we can't use the same concepts of planning. We've got to use different ways to plan. And that's where I began to think differently about the whole concept. And that's where we came up with the idea of adaptive planning.
And that is so important. When you were talking about British Petroleum, BP, I remember too, many years ago, they said BP no longer stood for British Petroleum, but it was beyond petroleum.
That's correct.
And looking at solar, looking at, gas, looking at other items such as that, wind power, whatever the case might be, alternative forms of energy, which we're moving into at a great pace today. Now, within this master capacity builder, there are 4 concepts. Is that correct? What are those 4 concepts?
Well, and the idea of the master capacity builder is to look to the long term and to help prepare new ways of thinking, to help build what we call capacities for transformation. We believe there are 2 concepts of change, Bill. The reforming change, where you in effect take an old idea and you refine it, improve it, enhance it, but you don't challenge the underlying assumption, whether it's in education or governance or whatever. But in transformative, in master capacity builder, which are the practitioners of transformational leadership, then you are thinking about what are the weak signals before they become trends. How are they going to impact various parts of a community and a society and economy? How do we need to adapt our ways we do things? What kind of research and development projects? So the master capacity builder is, and the reason we gave it that name is because of the fact that we're developing new capacities to be able to help transform our communities and our society.
Now, what we were talking about up to this point, we're really talking about the process, and we're talking about methodology to some degree as far as how we look at how we view, what are we going to do in urban areas? How are we going to deal with, in 2050, 75% of all the people in the world living in urban areas?
Right.
How do we move from the old fossil fuels to clean energy? How do we move to solar? How do we move to wind? Who are the professions? You have the theoretical concepts, the planning process, but what are the professions that can be involved in this to really implement these ideas and to view how they're doing it move away from that traditional approach to this more modernistic approach that you're talking about?
Well, actually, that's what Communities of the Future has been doing for 20 years. I have a passion for rural areas, and rural areas are really struggling and are really in a lot of trouble, in my opinion. Because, as you say, the metropolitan areas, and I believe I'm right in this, and within the last year or two, that 50.1 or more than 50% of the population of the world now live in metropolitan areas. And so that will continue. And I think you and I were talking about a little earlier the fact that by the year 2030, 25 or 30, I never get caught up in specifics, that you're going to have approximately 75% of the people that will in fact be living in metropolitan areas. So going back to your previous question, I did this on purpose. The ability to build capacity transformation, and as a master capacity builder in the way in which we've helped evolve this and working with people in local communities as well as organizations and otherwise, is you need certain skills. You need to be able to identify weak signals that I mentioned. You need to understand how, in a conversation or building a strategy for the long run, how do you look for access points where you can slip in an idea about the future or a trend or a weak signal? And how can you, in effect, then be able to design what we call parallel processes in a little community, Conover, North Carolina, my state that I'm from. I have a city manager that really is a sharp fella. And he understands you can't move this, you can't force feed this kind of change, but you can seed it and you can let it evolve. So we've been talking about building 5 parallel processes, one in education, one in the getting citizens involved and surveying them, one in developing master capacity builders because you need a core group, and 2 other processes that I won't mention. And the whole concept then of how do you lay the base for that and how do you seed it? And it is in a strategic plan, you set priorities and you hold people accountable. Well, in adaptive planning, it's exactly the opposite. You seed new ideas and new people and processes and you connect them all over the place. And then you watch what begins to emerge. It's called self-organizing. And it's tied into the concept of what's called complex adaptive systems. So you can make these, quote, theories very practical and you can apply them. One of the real key ideas to this, though, if somebody says, well, that's not practical, chances are they're looking at what was practical in the past. And what's going to be practical in the future is going to be different than what's practical in the past. Yeah, I have
quite a difference there.
I have a favorite quote by a guy named Richard Ogle that wrote the book Smart World. And it's about education, but it relates to what the question you asked me. He's quoted in that book as saying that Western education is based on 2 key principles and assumptions. 1, rationality, and 2, knowledge that already exists, and by definition, you look backwards. But in an age of exponential change, which we've been talking about in this conversation, and things are moving so fast and so interdependent and complex, then you need the skills of intuition, insight, imagination, and innovation. And by definition, you look forward. So the whole concept of how we educate and learn, how we build connections, how we survey citizens, how we get them involved directly, that is all research and development, and that's why our work is always looking forward and is research and development. And so what is practical of the future is going to be very different than what's practical in the past.
It certainly is. And of course, now our viewers, before we go too far on this, they can go to www.communitiesofthefuture.org.
That's right.
Your group, and
That's
learn
correct.
a lot more about what we're talking about today.
That's correct.
And tap in. You said, where can you tap in? This is an ideal place to do that. Well, let's talk about some specifics as far as events that are taking place right now that are overwhelming. One, Undoubtedly, climate change, according to most scientists, 97% of the scientists and many leaders, is the number one problem we confront today. North Korea is a problem, Syria is a problem, human rights may be a problem, but climate change is overwhelming us. The Arctic ice is melting, even the Antarctic ice is melting, which was not supposed to happen, but it is happening. And this is one thing, along with many others, we'll talk about some others too, but how is that, as one event, one tangible event that is certainly changing the way we look at how we do business, how we use fossil fuels, how we use other types of clean energy? What is the role for climate change?
Well, I've been interested personally in this. I've been concerned about this for 25 years. Dear friend of mine who's no longer alive, Bob Theobald, was a well-known futurist. And he's from England and came over to the States, and he introduced me to this. And that was about the time that the International Panel for Climate Control was being formed. And so you mentioned 97%.
It was 1987.
1987,
Yes.
that's right. I wouldn't have been able to come up with the exact date, but that's right. You're absolutely right. And that's when Bob and I started talking about this.
Yes, right. Formed by the United Nations.
Exactly. And so you have the IPCC, as it's called, where all of the scientists basically say this is not something that comes every 10,000 years, although that may be a part of it. But the whole concept of humanity, because of carbon dioxide, methane over in Russia, for instance. Greenland, last year, if you may remember, had a whole week when every square foot of Greenland had some melting to it, which had never happened before. So the idea is if we get 2% centigrade increase from where it is right now, then the breadbasket of the United States, you know, the Nebraska, Kansas, that area of the country, which feeds millions, the numbers say you'll shift up to Canada. So therefore, that the ability to be concerned about this. Now, let me tell you one thing we're doing as a part of our work that relates to climate change, because a part of this is helping people understand this, as well as being able to change the way they see the world. So it's a way you think about things. We have a group. I graduated from a college called Davidson College in North Carolina. If you, since this is such a basketball state, Davidson gets to the round of 8 every 40 years. So I got to be 113 before Davidson gets back to the round of 8. Stephen Curry, of course, is a graduate. Well, and the reason I bring that up is because we had our 50th reunion 3 years ago, and 15 to 18 of us got to talking, and we said, well, what if we start meeting? And long story short, Bill, over the last 5 months, the 15 of us have co-authored an article that really is focused on the concern for our grandchildren. But in that article, the number one issue that we want people to begin to understand and think about is the fact that climate change is going to have a tremendous impact negatively if we don't begin to collaborate globally together and work on reducing methane emissions, carbon dioxide, many other aspects of the whole process. And so if graduates of 74 and 5 years of age are concerned about this, we hope to at least have some small impact, but connect with other people that are concerned about this as well.
We're going to have to, I hate to say we're down to our last 30 seconds, artificial intelligence, robotics are putting people out of work. Every day we see that happening. What can we do very quickly to confront this particular issue? Because we're moving forward. We're not stopping in using artificial intelligence, and robots are replacing humans. What can be done?
That's an imponderable right now. By that I mean it's a big question mark. And real quickly, the ability to be able to understand what is coming in terms of economic issues. There's a fellow out in Colorado, Thomas Fry, who's head of the Da Vinci Institute, and he is predicting that by the year 2030, there will be 2 billion jobs lost in the world. We think a new type of economy is beginning to emerge, and that we're going to have to build capacities of much more entrepreneurial people that are much more entrepreneurial and connect together and use broadband and use these technologies to, in fact, totally transform the way the economy operates.
Exactly. As you mentioned, climate change is our number one problem, artificial intelligence, robotics. And another one we need to look at, and we encourage our viewers to go to your website, at communitiesofthefuture.org, talking about income inequality. This can be absolutely, totally destabilizing for societies. But Rick Smyre, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate the opportunity to converse with you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for the invitation.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.